Hey y'all, I'm Kelly Moody and you're listening to the Ground Shots podcast, an audio project exploring our relationship to ecology through conversations and storytelling with farmers, herbalists, craftspeople, naturalists, artists, and more. Hey y'all, welcome to episode 4 of the Ground Shots podcast. I'm currently sitting in my camper in northern Idaho at Jim and Melody Croft's homestead. I came here last year for about a month or so to hang out with them and do hide tanning and other crafts, and also take a class with Jim Croft, a bookbinding class. And it's definitely been a really wonderful place to spend time. So I'm really excited to be back here for a quick visit with them, and brought a few friends, and that was really sweet to do. It's really nice to see their land, or this land here in this season, a little more fall, cool weather. It's a little weird though, waking up at 4:30 every morning to the clear-cut logging that's happening. I'm not quite sure how far away it is, but it definitely reverberates over here to their land. So yeah, this episode of the podcast interviews Turtle. And Turtle lived in Asheville, North Carolina for a long time, but he's kind of like me, a little nomadic, but also like really very much a gardener, plant person, and has a deep connection with working with plants. And in Asheville, he did a lot of things, and I don't know all of the things that he did, but I do know that he helped start some community garden projects. He was involved in the local EcoVillage. He really took to fermentation, mead-making, and other ferments, and even contributed to Sandor Katz's book, The Art of Fermentation, a little bit. And he also does a lot of walks and pilgrimages, and that's the gist of what we're going to talk about in this episode. And especially his walk across California in the name of Frank Cook. And he's also involved with Plants and Healers International, an organization that was formed because of Frank Cook, and we'll talk about who that person is in the interview as well. And also a little bit about pilgrimage in general, and the Camino de Santiago, which is also a pilgrimage I did over 10 years ago in my early 20s, and the need for a place in our culture for transient folks, or hobos, or like people that are existing in between. I think that was something that I was really excited to talk to Turtle about. So with that said, I'm really excited for y'all to hear this episode. And I'd also wanted to mention that we're almost at 50 patrons on Patreon, and I really am appreciating the folks that have started supporting me in this project, and all the little things that it encompasses. So thank you so much. And with that, let's listen to the episode with Turtle. Thank you. Burn with the light that reveals our faces. Burn with the heat that will warm these places. So I'm sitting here with Turtle / Sky Leon, right? Your newer name that you want to go by these days. And we're actually, is this Rough and Ready, technically, California we're in?
It's technically Nevada City,
California. Although we both have lived in Asheville, North Carolina, so that's kind of an interesting connection of having been in the South. And we've been hanging out here, and we realized we both have done pilgrimages of some sort, and talking to Turtle more about his pilgrimages has really gotten me interested in thinking about that more again. So here we are, and I really wanted to interview Turtle and kind of talk about that, and maybe some other tangential things that come off of that theme. So, yeah, maybe you can start with what your main pilgrimage was in California and what the whole sort of background of that was for you.
Yeah, so the pilgrimage in California, we were calling it the Green Path, aka the TransCalifornia Trail.
Mm-hmm.
And it was inspired in me because I had walked across Spain and France on the Camino de Santiago and had fallen in love with pilgrimage. I just really gravitated toward the whole concept of taking the time to walk, to journey, and to relate to the world and the human scale. You know, we spend so much time zipping around in cars, flying around in airplanes, living inside of cities and supermarkets and places that don't relate to the scale that our fingers and toes are meant for. You know what I mean? And so I had this sense or this feeling that somehow being for several months walking would return me to a sense of that connection.
So you did the Camino de Santiago first. What year did you do that?
So I've walked it twice. First there, in other words, I've walked to the Santiago de Compostela, the church, and then beyond to Finisterre, which is the coast. It's 3 days more from the church to the coast. The traditional pagan ending point was this place called Finisterre, end of the earth. And then that was in 2009. And then in 2017, I returned to Finisterre and walked back to France, to the place where I started from. So as to complete that whole sort of cycle. But sandwiched inside of that pilgrimage was the walk across California that I did. And that was done, like I was saying, was to create an opportunity for people to have access to a bona fide, if you will, pilgrimage route without having to fly to Europe to do it. You know, so many of us people that want to live humbly, live spiritually, live close to the earth, it's just outside of our means and our even time frame to go fly halfway around the world to do a spiritual walk. And so this walk across California was visioned as being a more local, for one, pilgrimage, but also a more close to the earth pilgrimage. Whereas in Spain, and in many, for that matter, pilgrimages, holy, journeys to holy sites are so focused on the churches along the way. Nothing wrong with that. I love churches and the architecture and the space, the spiritual space that's found within that. But what if the redwoods are the cathedrals? What if the rivers are the hallowed ground? What if the plants that we meet along the way in each, unique little ecosystem, in doing plant walks, you find that the plants that grow in this watershed and the plants that grow in this watershed are often different, but it's not until you walk for 16 days, for 300 miles, that you really realize the context of, what that feels like, to be in these different ecosystems. Some of them have the same plants, they just grow differently. And so this journey, the Green Path, was really meant to be a pilgrimage that reflected a spiritual approach to earth, as opposed to a spiritual approach to the heavens, which I feel like, and no judgment toward any spiritual approach, but ones that are expansive, and then something that's, the earth-based approach that's more in the now, like in my life. And so that journey was inspired, and I had been turned on to the route by a late friend, Frank Cook, who had walked that route in 2002. He walked from the coast to Lake Tahoe, the width of California, 300 some odd miles. And he had done that because, and this was a friend of mine, and if some people may or may not know him, but he was a really special herbalist and botanist and plant lover and teacher. And he was a really dynamic character who traveled all over the world, teaching and sharing with people and inspiring ultimately people to go upon the green path, if you will. This was a term he used to reference that journey. And so it was one that I sort of co-opted for my pilgrimage. It wasn't, he wasn't the first one to walk it, because he had been inspired by a man by the name of John Olmsted, who was, I believe, the grandchild, perhaps great-grandchild of Frederick Law Olmsted, who was a famous architect of city parks and things. And he had actually surveyed, if I'm not mistaken, the route across the United States. And so he had come out to California, Frederick Olmsted, and then his grandson had grown up here, John Olmsted, who had lived in Nevada City here, actually just a mile from here on Owl Creek Road is where John Olmsted passed away. And he was a land conservationist. He was just someone who was very passionate, beyond the norm, to protect lands. And so he spent all of his time generating donations to his visions of protecting land and saving land and conserving it for to be wild, basically. And so his I think greatest accomplishment was the creation of the Independence Trail, which converted an old mining era irrigation ditch into a wheelchair accessible trail, so that people who are handicapped can also enjoy nature. And so he's a really instrumental figure in the Northern California conservation scene. And he had inspired Frank to do this walk across California because John had also done this walk. I don't know what year that was, probably in the 90s.
And the same route. The exact same route, pretty much.
I don't think exact is the word. So,
similar. Yeah.
So far I've mentioned 3 people, Frank, John, and myself. And there's one other character who I'll mention soon. And the 4 of us all took slightly different routes. There's a lot of overlap, but it roughly follows a line from the town of Mendocino to Lake Tahoe. And there's, we each found different ways around certain challenges. In other words, there's highways and mountains and lakes and reservoirs and big valleys and rivers and things that are difficult to overcome to just a hiking person. But we each approach those in different ways. And the goal forward is to find a way to streamline all those pieces, because all of us had different challenges, and all of us failed at those challenges in different ways. In other words, there's still work to be done. A 5th person could certainly walk across with their route and find a better one, learning from our mistakes. So anyway, what I want to say about John Olmsted, because it's really his vision, this whole thing, this whole route. He didn't call it a pilgrimage, I don't think. His idea was creating a living corridor, that there would be a corridor across Northern California. I believe it's at roughly the 39-degree parallel. And that it would be this parcels of land that were all connected, whether they be state parks or land conservations or private land that's held in some kind of deed or trust, but that it would be accessible by people and animals, and that it would be left largely wild, and that it would go from end to end, from the coast to Lake Tahoe. And so that is really the driving force behind this vision. And as I said, I think, was it after? I think it was maybe after Frank walked this. It could have been before, that a man by the name of Stephen Hine also walked. He's a local nature poet, really amazing guy.
Local to this area?
Local to this area, to Nevada County. Mm-hmm. And conservationist. And he and his circle started the Mendocino Tahoe Conservancy, which is another nonprofit organization that's in the area, I think, to achieve the goals of developing John Olmsted's legacy, just as a circle of people in the United States, meaning we're on both coasts. Actually, we have a board member in England as well, started the Plants and Healers International organization, nonprofit organization, to continue the legacy of Frank Cook's work. You can find out more, listeners, at plantsandhealers.org about Frank Cook and our mission, per se. But specific to the green walk was that the green path was really, I think, a collective vision that 4 people had added to. Like it was kind of like becoming this sort of building upon. When I came and set out upon that journey, it was in 2011. It was March of 2011. And John Olmsted had just passed away a week before I left. And so I hadn't learned of Stephen Hine at that point. And so when I was walking on the Green Path pilgrimage across California, I believed that I was the only person living that had gone that way.
Wait, you said John Olmsted passed, you mean Frank Cook passed?
Frank Cook passed in 2009.
Okay.
John Olmsted passed in 2011.
Okay.
So both of the previous people that I was aware of, as I said, I wasn't aware of Stephen Hine's existence or presence upon that trail. But at that point I set out, I had this strange sense that I was somehow remembering something that was going to maybe be forgotten if it hadn't been experienced, and so due to a unique or interesting series of events, I ended up walking it backward. In other words, I walked it from my front door to the coast. John, I think all 3 other people had walked it from the coast to Lake Tahoe. But I was in Nevada City, which is 100 miles from Lake Tahoe. So I ended up walking it in two sections, this journey. But it was somewhat appropriate because by walking from my home to the coast, I left arrows behind that would point the way for the would-be pilgrim. In other words, if any of you out there decide to take this journey, in theory, you could begin at Jug Handle State Park.
It's a place I love a lot, and you just told me that was the destination point.
And that rang your heart.
Yeah.
Right. And for me, that was the destination, but for the would-be pilgrim, that would be the beginning point. In other words, in order to leave arrows behind, stickers, little green arrow stickers that I put on stop signs and on telephone poles and light poles and all along the way, I left these arrows that would point, turn left, turn right, go straight.
This is something that you got from the Camino, right?
Yeah.
The yellow arrow / shell is a Camino thing, and I did the Camino de Santiago.
And what year did you do it again?
I did it
in
2007.
Yeah.
So before you.
Mm-hmm.
But I did it with a professor in college who hiked the Appalachian Trail, a section of the Appalachian Trail every year, and he his thing was pilgrimage, studying pilgrimage in the wilderness, and he used the Appalachian Trail for that purpose. And he then decided to start doing the Camino with students and studying the relationship to pilgrimage as a religious experience through that with the students. So now he does it every other year with students, and he's done it a bunch of times. And now he's hiked the AT a couple times, which is a whole other thing.
It's a whole different pilgrimage.
It's
a good one.
Or the PCT. I wanted to ask you.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you have a lot more to say about this, but what makes this different than, say, someone who wants to do a through hike through like a trail that's very, like the PCT, like I just mentioned?
Right. Good question. I mean, I only have a snide answer in that this one goes east to west and the other ones go north to south. And maybe there's something to say about following the setting sun or something like that. I don't know. In other words, the Camino de Santiago runs from east to west. And there's something about
east to west
following that setting sun. And when I walked the route just recently, the Camino de Santiago from the end back to the beginning again, I was walking in an eastwardly direction. And it was a different energy, but I was a different person, and you're encountering people as opposed to
with them.
And so there was so many variables that I could talk later about. But
something that struck me about the Camino personally was that it didn't distinguish where it took you. Like, and I think what you're saying about this pilgrimage across California, you're not just going to walk in the prettiest wild places the whole time. You're also walking by highways, you're walking through suburbia, you're walking through industrial complexes. And for me, the Camino really, like, the fact that it was, the sacred was all of those things, or that you had to deal with, like, the ups and downs, or, like, to be by cars going by you every day, and how intense that feels.
Absolutely. That, to me, was what I actually loved about it the most, was that it was like hitchhiking without the cars. You were constantly in the scene, the human scene. And there was moments where it would go over a ridge or a mountain or something, and you'd have some time alone to be in the woodsy thing. But and actually, I mean, great long periods of moment.
Yeah.
But it was somehow both, and you were always, when you were in a quiet zone, you were still near a farm or walking through farmland or something like that. And my walk across California, similarly, there was times when I was in the woods and times when I was on the mountain, but there was also times when I was right there on the shoulder of the road. We need to fix that, because at this point I wouldn't recommend people walking certain sections of the walk that I did, just because would be dangerous, and I would feel bad about having recommended it to someone. But I think therein lies the difference. And I thought about this a lot when I compared and contrasted the Appalachian Trail and the Transcontinental, or the Camino de Santiago and the Green Path pilgrimage, to the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail. And I think that I don't want to sound general in this, because I think it's a general statement, but there's a certain sportiness.
Yeah, for sure. There's like a how many miles can I do today thing on the through hikes, which is for some people their thing, and for me it's too fast,
Right, and they're set up for that, and there's drops for the food drops, and I feel like it's a more, and by sporty I don't mean like as in like sports, but sporty in the sense of like hiking, camping, like mountaineering, like there's a ruggedness to it. I mean, the Camino de Santiago is luxury compared to that, because every night you're staying in these refugios or dormitories that are hospitaleros for the pilgrims, and they're actually very, very affordable. And so, but I mean, to some people, they would never want to stay in a room full of people snoring. They would much rather sleep in a tent that they carried all day up a mountain underneath the skies. And in some ways, the walk across California is that, because it is camping. But or for me, I had a rain fly that I set up just because it's so dry out here. There's no need for a tent. But
and you would set it up on random private land.
Yeah, that it was definitely quote unquote squatting. Like I was definitely like ducking into orchards after dark and just again, then I probably wouldn't even use a rainfly of any sort. But at times I would set up off a chain link fence or something like that, like back in the corner of a park or some place where I could just slip in and dwell. But that was exciting and fun. I mean, I think it was, a unique experience in that regard. And so far we're talking specifically in my mind anyway, about the western section from Nevada City to Lake Tahoe. That was the first stretch that I walked. And that was, I think it was about 200 miles. And I did that in 26 days, which was pretty fast. So I walked to the coast and that was 16 days and that was 200 miles. And that was,
it's actually not that long.
It's pretty good. And it was a great walk. It was kind of a forced march because I was really trying to make a certain time frame. But I was leaving these stickers behind that pointed the route across the state.
Have you seen them here and there?
Yeah. Like, what is it now? 8 years later? Like, they're still out there. A lot of them.
That's awesome.
There's some that I've seen that have faded, the ones that are in direct sun. But a lot of them are still out. They actually held up really well. So the route itself, it followed sections of the Highway 20. And then at times I could break away and go off into, like, say, the Mendocino National Forest and go up and down, up and down, up and down. Mm-hmm. It goes along right through the Wilbur Hot Springs. So there was a good hot spring soak involved. It goes through the Ore Hot Springs, which was another nice soak. It goes across the Central Valley through Yuba City, and it goes through Ukiah. So it has these two major, not they're major cities, but major urban anchors, environments that it travels through. But for the most part, it's out under the wide skies and dark nights with stars. But there is quite a bit of it along the Highway 20. And so the call out is to find people that would be interested in walking 2-3 day sections and figuring out what could be alternated to make it flow a little smoother.
With the ultimate goal of trying to figure out how to piece together private or land between those 2 points that would feel safe for people to walk that route. Although there's a certain aspect of like experiencing that part of civilization that is, but even on the Camino, everyone knew that you're a pilgrim. They made concessions for pilgrims. You felt safe generally as a pilgrim, to be able to kind of be a squatter sometimes.
I never got harassed once on the Camino de Santiago by the police. And on this journey, I was harassed twice. And by harassed, it wasn't bad. It just was, they wanted my driver's license. They wanted to find out who I was. They wanted to see what was going on. And it wasn't really all that bad, but I was definitely profiled and targeted as not belonging. Yeah. And that went for the locals as well. There was certainly moments where I was approached by trucks and things, people who were legitimately concerned. I totally understand their perspective, which was that I was walking down a random back road into a dead-end cove with the intention of hiking up a forested trail and crossing a ridge. And there was no reason why anyone should have been back in that road, let alone a bearded guy with long hair and a backpack. So it was, but it was funny when I told them I was walking to the coast. People kind of, they shut up a little bit, and because they could see I was serious and they could realize that I was actually intending to do this. They usually wanted to argue with me that I was going the wrong way. But I had maps, and I had it marked out, and I was pretty clear about I spent a lot of time researching my route, and so I knew I knew what I was getting into, and they usually let me pass by. There was some people that weren't so friendly. And then there was a lot of people that really wanted to help. And that's, I think, the beautiful thing, and the thing that I was looking forward to the most was that kind of like living on a prayer, like living at the kindness of others. It's so rare that we have that opportunity to do that these days. I remember when I was younger, following the Grateful Dead and so forth, there was so many moments that were just made extra special by the fact that there was people who gifted us along in our journey, our gypsy kind of ways. And so there were moments where there was people who saved me. I remember there was one point where I was walking somewhere in between Grass Valley and Yuba City on the very rural road in the hot sun, and I wouldn't call it a barren space, but definitely just fields of yellow grass. And this car pulled over, and there was these, I think they even circled back around and came back to me. And there was two Latino guys that gave me a gallon of water.
Wow.
And I just had that feeling of they like understood so much better than so many people in their air-conditioned big truck. These guys somehow they just related on a very different level, because maybe they had been through a similar pilgrimage in their own journey. And so in my impeccable Spanish, I said, gracias, man. Buen dia. But it was a beautiful moment, and those happened along the way. And it's like I said, it's like hitchhiking without the cars, because you have these really kind of synchronistic moments. And I think bringing it back to the through hikes, the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, and I think they have their own version of magic when through hiker meets through hiker, and something, or a person that's on a day hike meets a through hiker and gives them a bunch of Cliff Bars or whatever. But there's something about being in the general populace, and in Santiago de Compostela in Spain, you have this shell that hangs from your backpack, this conch shell thing that is a symbol of who you are, this pilgrim, and there's something that everybody knows what's going on. And I had many moments especially in France and in northern France, where I began, where there's far less pilgrims, where there was moments of like beatitude or whatever, where people took me aside and gifted me somehow, or some, you go to pay your bill at a coffee shop or something, and they just wave it and say, don't worry, that kind of thing, where people just nurture the pilgrim,
which is not something that readily happens per se in this culture. I mean, I've done parts of the AT and definitely had then tried to hitchhike to town and be like, oh, you're a hiker, okay, a through hiker. Right. Or people who do trail magic and they leave food for hikers. But outside of that, I don't know. I mean, I think any attempt we can make to cultivate more of that normalcy behind doing pilgrimages, in the way that you did, would be awesome. So. Mm-hmm.
I think they should exist all over, and there's other pilgrimage routes, even in through the U.S., but even one in California. There's one along the ancient Spanish monasteries that go from San Diego to, I think, Monterey, or I think there's even one further north, Point Reyes. Mm-hmm. But they're, again, though, that's even more through an urban area, as I understand this pilgrimage. I mean, as I say, as we talk about it, I don't want to underestimate the fact that it does go through a lot of wilderness areas. And so I'll even shift then to part 2, which is that after, having walked 20 days or what it was, 16 days to the coast, and leaving these green arrow stickers that point all the way basically to the front door that I walked out of, then at 6 months later, I think roughly 5 months, in September of 2011, I set out again
from Nevada
City to walk to Lake Tahoe. So this is part 2 of this kind of journey. I did it in 2 parts. And at this point, I had accomplices. There was people who had wanted to join me. And so my good friend, Mark Williams, the executive director of Plants and Healers International, was there with me. And Patrick Ironwood, who was a Tennessee native from the Sequatchie Valley Institute, a.k.a. Moonshadow. And his partner, Marissa, what's her last name? Do you know her last name? Marissa, we love you. We don't know your last name.
So starts with a P.
It does. It's a beautiful last name, and it's definitely difficult to pronounce. Marissa was with us, and so there was 4 of us that set out that afternoon in September to walk to Lake Tahoe. And the first stretch was the Yuba River watershed. And so for those of you who are familiar with the Yuba River, it's a deep ravine almost. Not ravine, I mean, it's a river. It's a big, fast-flowing river with giant boulders. And there's a trail that follows it. And
or one fork of it, because there's 3 forks.
There's 3 forks, and we were on the southern fork. But it's a big river, folks, and it's a big, deep canyon, is really the best way. I said ravine, but I meant canyon. And so ultimately we set out walking, and we started at Jones Bar, which is where the Independence Trail that I mentioned earlier, created by John Olmsted, finishes. And in other words, it starts at the 49 crossing. So we walked from Jones Bar in kind of the reverse direction, because now I'm walking westward, or eastward rather, and it went all the way up the Yuba Valley until it got to the Excelsior Ditch Trail, and then that's a driveway basically that goes all the way up the mountain. And at this point, we began this game of going up and down the sides of the ravine, and we would just keep wanting to be on the river ultimately, but the trail itself would take us through long switchbacks as we would traverse one face of the canyon, and then it would bring us back down. The river was too difficult. There was no trail. There was only rocks.
And sometimes it can just be like nothing. It just goes straight down.
It just goes straight down. And the water, this river rises so high that it blows it out in the wintertime. And so any trail that had ever been created needed to be so far above the river that the only way to do that was to create big, deep switchbacks that went up tributary creeks. And so to go 1 mile of river length meant that you had to walk 7 miles of switchback trails all the way up the ravine and all the way back down to the river, and then up and then down. I mean, it was tedious, and it took us, I want to say 3 days, 4 days to get up the valley, up the Yuba River to the Doolittle Trail. And the Doolittle Trail is just outside of the town of Washington, and it goes directly up. It climbs 2,000 feet in no time. I mean, it's a nearly vertical trail. But that was the only way in and out of that river watershed for probably 500 years, or more. I don't know how old that trail is, but it must have been an ancient trail because it was the only spot where you could really carve something out. And so that was a very tough journey. And we got up to the top of the Yuba River watershed, where we encountered a beautiful lake by the name of Rucker's Lake. And we had a reunion of friends that all met us there, and we collected ourselves together and did a really nice tribute to the concept of, we brought children that were learning about our walk, and it was a whole kind of educational moment. And then the next day, only 2 of us continued on, and that was Patrick and I. The others had decided that that it was going to be a different journey for them, and they were looking for a different outcome. And so 2 of us moved on and walked through the Grouse Ridge Wilderness area. So at this point, we were talking about how pilgrimage and journeying through urban areas or things like that is part of. We did not see anyone at this point.
It's like the opposite.
It was like the opposite.
Intense wilderness.
Way, way, way out there. And it was really beautiful. I mean, there was an incredible amount of that whole area up there in the Sierra Nevada mountain ranges is dotted with all of these glacier lakes. And so everywhere we walked, there was just these beautiful lakes. And as hot as it was, they were too cold to jump in. I mean, we got a good birthday swim. It was my birthday. And so I got a good birthday dunk in one of the coldest lakes I've ever gotten into. But it was amazing up there. And then eventually at a place called White Rock, we encountered the Pacific Crest Trail and then joined that trail southbound for another 4 hours, maybe 2 hours, 3 hours, till we hit the where the Pacific Crest Trail crosses Highway 80, which is a significant location.
Donner Pass, right?
Donner Pass. And
I skied that in that area.
Yeah, I went right underneath chairlifts and everything because south of 80, the trail then begins to climb back up into some really high, beautiful, amazing. You're ultimately walking the spine of the Pacific, of the Sierra Nevada mountain range on the Pacific Crest Trail, but you don't. It's just it's almost like a very dry. There's very few plants, and the trail is like a tiny pea gravel. It's was one of the most intense landscapes I've been in a long time.
And in September too, since it hasn't rained.
Yeah, water was an issue. There was a lot of need to be really clear with water. I'm glad that I was on that journey with other people, because when we hit the 80, we met back up with our friend Paul joined us, and a videographer named Jonas, and then Marissa came back on.
Is there a video somewhere that exists of this last part?
Allegedly. I'm not that aware of how much video was taken of that. But yeah, there was definitely video made, and interview and stuff, some things that had gone on around that. That was part of a greater documentary that was being made about Frank Cook. And so it's a good question. It would be nice to track that footage down. But yeah, that last leg of the journey was it was nice that there was, that we had like water reservoirs and things like that to store the water that we harvested, that we could split the weight between a small group of people as opposed to just one person having to really, there was so little spring water available, like seeps and stuff like that. But there were patches of snow even in September where I could harvest the water from. So on the last day, or the second to last day, the people had other agendas and they left me. And so I had one more night alone on the pilgrimage before I descended down into Lake Tahoe to complete my journey. And so that was a 10-day stretch that was probably maybe 100 miles.
A totally different experience than walking across the Central Valley, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yet, I don't know, parallel in other ways, You have a little thing you wrote about pilgrimage for you, like from your perspective, and this, what you're calling it, the Green Path Trail. And I thought it'd be cool if you read it.
Through the ages, many cultures have used the act of pilgrimage to strengthen and deepen one's connection to the higher realms and the spiritual path. The process of walking across the land to a holy destination operates on a practical as well as symbolic level, speaking to the pilgrim in terms of a great journey and opening them to the mysterious. In 2002, the late Frank Cook, herbalist and planetary visionary, walked from California's Mendocino coast to the shores of Lake Tahoe. He was preceded in this adventure by naturalist and land conservationist John Olmsted and nature poet Stephen Hine. These three all shared a common dream of a green corridor running from sea to mountain, connecting public land trusts, state parks, and wildlife preserves, held together by trails and footpaths, shared and traversed by four-legged and two-legged beings. In 2011, in memory of both Frank and John's passing, efforts were made to realize that dream. Green arrow stickers were placed along a proposed route, guiding the future pilgrim from Jug Handle State Park to Lake Tahoe. The walk stretches 300 miles, journeying over hills and mountains, across the wide Central Valley, along the Sacramento and Yuba rivers, through glades of brilliant wildflowers and beneath branches of ancient redwood trees. There is even a hot spring to soak in along the way. The goal in creating a green pilgrimage is to blend the physical and spiritual healing principles of a long walk with the powerful sensations of awakening and reconnecting to nature. The alchemy becomes a powerful process of transformation for the enduring seeker, willing to take the time and walk through the pain that comes with meeting tall mountains, long days, cold nights, deep fears, and personal limitations, all of which are overcome through the journey of pilgrimage.
So when you did this, how did it feel for you to walk in a space that your friend who had passed walked in? And did you think about him often and think about what he thought about the land and the plants and the trail and stuff?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because the impetus for doing this actually came from that very idea. In other words, I had just come out to California from the East Coast, from North Carolina. I was only intending to be here for the fall and the winter. And I was in my truck driving across the Highway 20. And I had stopped to, quote unquote, relieve myself. And I had found a little little forested spot where I could be discreet. And noticing somebody along a bike path. There was a bike path there, and someone had built a bench with a tin roof overhang and a little map thing. It was a little spot. And I thought, man, Frank must have walked along this bike path. And, I'm looking at the bench and the table and looking for some kind of Frank was here, carved, graffiti carved into, I kind of wanted there to be this affirmation for my own suspicions that he had actually been there. And there wasn't. But then I had this feeling of, wouldn't it be beautiful to actually go re-walk his walk and make little effigies, make little art installations that honored that concept of a TransCalifornia Trail.
For folks that, I know you've talked about Frank Cook a little bit and explained a little bit about what he did and who he was, and he's touched so many people's lives, not just in North Carolina and California too and beyond, but maybe just a little bit of a context for why it felt like why he would be someone that would cause other people to walk a trail for him. What was it about this person who I've never met but I've heard a lot of people talk about, including my teacher Juliet. And so yeah, I would, if you would like to, a little bit. I know it's hard to do, maybe in a few sentences.
Well, here's the thing about Frank, is that he was so clear in his vision, so sure of himself and what he held as this high mark for not society, but for the individual, like this idea that you could drop me anywhere and within a few miles I could make dinner out of wild plants. Like, he had this feeling about himself and this astute perception that any of us could be there. Like, there wasn't a need to be an ethnobotanist or an herbalist that there was just a few plants that you needed to know that would give you that security in that space. And so he had a character about him that delivered this almost, it's easy to know this. And it's our duty to know this. And it's beautiful and fun to know this. Like, he brought an energy to it that I've never seen anyone else really bring to it. And he brought it in such a way that inspired so many people to want to be herbalists. And this was at a time when that wasn't like people weren't running off to find herbal schools to train within. He was connecting to a very early scene as far as the people who were interested in herbalism, and he was inspiring us to go out there and find out what our passion was. And it was really neat. Something that I remember about Frank that was special was that he would find each one of our niches, the thing that we excelled at, and then inspire us to be the expert on that. He kind of came from this place of, I can't do this alone. I need all of you to figure out what your contribution to the movement is. So he was like a flagship in a sense. Like, he held down a particular part of the language, but he inspired each person in their own way to become experts in their niche or their field.
What do you feel like yours is?
For me, I think he inspired me to be the fermenter. Like, he pushed me in this direction. And because I have a interesting approach, I was a farmer. I was a gardener. I was doing permaculture. I was really working with domestic crops. In other words, at the time that my friendship with Frank was at its peak, he was studying and talking about lobelia or stinging nettle or mugwort or this hundreds and hundreds of genera of plants, and I was dealing with hundreds and hundreds of varieties of kale, onions, peas, beans, squash. I was a gardener. I was growing food, and so I was really as prolific in my understanding about varieties as he was in terms of genera and plant families. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Like, he had a very broad view, and in what I felt like was a broad view was actually like a very small niche of like plants that people were related to in terms of quote unquote domesticated,
the cultivated stuff, that we
cultivated plants. And so for me, the other side of the fence, the wild plants, was a bit overwhelming. And I would take plant walks, and I would walk and talk with my friends who were herbalists and who were people that were studying the more wild plants, but I didn't know what to do with them per se. I mean, I had my hands full. But when he taught me that I could take those plants and ferment them with honey and water and make mead, methaglens, as they're called, I suddenly became super inspired. Like that for me was my introduction to what one might call the green wall. The green wall being a term that Frank used to refer to when you meet the forest and it just feels like this green wall that's in front of you and you don't know anything about it. And then you begin to study and learn about this green wall that's in front of you, and you begin to learn each little pieces, all the little pieces that make up that environment that you're in. When I got to that place of meeting the green wall and learning about the plants that were there, my impetus, once I learned fermentation and how to brew and how to create beers and meads with those plants, it lit my passion. It just was something that I suddenly was like, oh, here's something I can do with this, as opposed to drying it for tea or making tinctures or making that didn't call to me. And so Frank inspired me in that direction. That said, California was a new place. Suddenly I was in a very different environment when I walked across California.
You'd never been to California before?
Wow. Had I been to California before? I don't think. I was briefly on a road trip through California, but no, this was Spain was 600 miles, but that 300-mile walk across California from the coast to Lake Tahoe
was one of your first experiences of actually being in California.
Truly immersing in it. I had been here for about 5 months beforehand, but that was basically like an autumn and a winter. And it was the following spring that I embarked upon this journey. And so, yeah, that was a new experience for me in a lot of ways. And a beautiful one. I mean, it was, to this day now, I can speak very deeply about a half a mile wide and 300-mile long section of California, in which I can speak to the roads, to the plants, to the feeling, to the demographic of that area, from having this very close up, as we said earlier, the concept of human scale. And when you walk that type of journey, it's like putting a magnifying glass right down on that map and really zooming in, because what normally takes 15 seconds to fly through on a car now takes 15 minutes.
It was something that when I did the Camino, and we touched on this before we started recording and a little bit during the recording, but the idea of, sometimes you have, and with your pilgrimage across California as well as across Spain, often those trails, unlike the PCT or AT, which don't seem to take you into that as much, but you have to walk by that all day, like a highway. And there's a thing you have to work through when you're being sped past and your feet hurt. You're sometimes you're walking on pavement and your feet hurt even more. And for me, that sense of the relationship with pain and what you actually feel, you're one foot in front of the other on the earth. And while that car is climate controlled, going really fast, the pain is sort of numbed, but you're witnessing that pain by doing it foot by foot, and also smelling everything and seeing the wind, seeing the birds, hearing things, and not just the pain is there, but also all these other beautiful things, which I guess is what life is too. You kind of get, it's not going to be all butterflies.
Yeah. And the people too, the people that you meet. And I remember there was this one morning where there had been some rain. And so I had a pretty rough sleep because I had a rain fly set up strung underneath this little bit of canopy of trees. And the next morning I woke up and I went nearby. There was like a little corner, like general store, because it's kind of rural, but it was like a little corner store. And I went in there and I got some coffee, and I came out and I had bought some little something that I was eating for breakfast. And I came out and there was this like 5 or 6 men standing around in a circle. There was a little picnic table right there where they were kind of hanging out. And they motioned that I should sit at the picnic table, kind of in their circle. So suddenly I was part of this circle of kind of guys, almost like hunters or something, like they kind of had this very rural energy to them. Different ages. And sit down here and enjoy your coffee, your breakfast, And so I sat there, and they got interested in my maps that I had, because I was looking over my map.
And they're like, "What are you doing?"
"What are you doing?" I'm walking to the coast." "Oh, wow. Fascinating." And these guys, I think they would meet there every morning.
Yeah.
For to just stand around and drink coffee with each other or something like this. So it's an interesting crowd, these 7 or 8 guys. And they got interested in the maps, and then they were talking to me about what I was doing, and it was clear that I was kind of accepted in this way, And I felt pretty good about that, and I was just shooting the shit with them about what I was doing. And then there was this one moment where the teddy bear that I was carrying.
You're carrying a teddy bear?
I had a teddy bear with me. This little tiny, teddy bear, like probably 6 inches tall. Just this little guy. His name was Kai Bear. And he fell out of my jacket. Like I had him zipped up in my rain jacket, And something happened, and I didn't even notice it. He had slipped out of the bottom of it and fallen on the ground. And one of them pointed and said, "You dropped your teddy bear," or something, And I said, "Oh, yeah, And it was all good. There was this moment where I was kind of ashamed, like a little bit like, "Oh, yeah, the teddy bear." And then there was this, like, it doesn't matter kind of moment. And there was this bridging of these, like, hunter kind of tough guy, like, drinking their coffee in the morning. And me, this sort of, like, long hair, bearded guy who was acting tough enough to walk across the state that I'd earned their respect, and then my teddy bear falls out, and it was like, they just got it. It was, water under the bridge for them. And it's like moments like that where you realize that you bridge a certain level through your own authenticity that creates, a unique experience. And that's, it's so easy to exist inside of a bubble of our own friends or our own archetypes. You can go off to Burning Man or off to a women's gathering or an herbal thing or a earth skills gathering or something, and stay inside of the niche of your own people. But somehow this pilgrimage, there was none of my people around. I was completely alone, completely vulnerable to the world. I was in the middle of it all. And it's like in those moments, it's like, can you handle it? Can you hold your own? Can you actually exist inside of this place and be authentic? Because I was being authentic with them, but not authentic enough to lay my teddy bear on the table. I had him zipped up inside my coat and he had snuck out, but in so doing it afforded me an opportunity to be authentic, and sometimes we need to be vulnerable, we need to be exposed and shown that it's okay to actually be ourselves. And so that was one of my favorite moments on that journey, really.
That's cool you say that, because I've done a lot of traveling the past few years away from a home base of what I feel like has been the safe community, in Asheville mainly, but there's been some other places I've found that in New England, and yeah. And being, outside of the comfort zone and out of the culture of where I grew up and the culture where I felt like I found community and felt like I could just be whoever, and meeting people that I wouldn't. I've always really liked to meet people outside of what I consider the little world I'm in. But even more so when you're out there on the road and things happen, the things you're afraid of happening happen, and then you deal with them, and like me telling you about my flat tire in the desert during a heat wave. And those moments create opportunities to connect with people that normally you would just keep walking and not talk to them out of shyness or feeling like you don't have anything to relate to. And I've had a lot of those experiences, and I think it creates a sense of perspective, seeing what people's worlds are and where they come from and why they. I mean, I had an experience last year where I ended up having dinner with a Mormon family during their Mormon family reunion while I was camping by myself. And it was actually in Idaho. I was talking earlier with you about that and then I ended up sitting with them like an hour and a half and hearing about their life. And they're like, "You're going where? To do stuff with bone tools?" Okay, well, we hunt elk. That's kind of interesting, but you're a woman traveling alone. That's interesting. But they never were like, "That's bad," But they were a little bit, we'd never met anyone like you, but that's kind of cool, but kind of, we don't know what to think, But then they fed me and I went on my way and never saw them again. It's kind of cool. So those are the kinds of things, like I normally would be afraid of camping by myself up around a bunch of people I don't know, and they all look kind of intimidating, and I'm like a femme person, and I just had to push through that. Yeah, and I remember on the Camino having moments like that too. I was with like a small group of people, but we would often be by ourselves or stay in different places and then get back together, and having moments where I would get lost and have to figure out how to and not know Spanish very well, and in my young 20s, that was definitely intense, and not that I feel like that's like a lesson I feel like we continuously learn.
But weren't those the best moments?
I definitely remember them. Yeah, for sure. Like during my travels last year, I remember those moments the most and feel like I think about those the most, And those bridges it's part of why I want to do this audio project, because I find myself often being from the small town rural South and traveling in these wide expanding places, and sometimes finding myself in a place like Nevada County or Nevada City where it's like pretty liberal, forward thinking. A lot of people think a certain way about things, and that's not the case in many places. And so the bridging element is something that I'm really curious about, and the idea of a pilgrimage as a bridge and the many ways it can be too is some food for thought too.
Mm-hmm.
And so, a lot of the sort of skills and things, just the crafts that I'm interested in, I've found that as being a thing that's the easiest way to bridge as well. Just being in conversation with someone where we have completely different political views, and then I'm like, okay, so where can I find a way that we can talk to each other as humans right now and not be telling each other that we're crap for believing what we believe? And then I'm like, oh, they're gonna like that I'm interested in this thing, and it's gonna make them completely challenge their assumptions about who I am. And this trail, has there been any movement on actually getting it designated as a real trail?
It's a great question. No, it's just like one of those things where it gets moved to the back corner of your desk, and it ends up being a pile of photos and a pile of writings and things like that requires really so much more energy. So as I said earlier, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this journey for another person.
The specific journey.
Yes, the specific route that I took. I spent a lot of time or enough time on the Highway 20, which was not a highway by practical standards, but it's a busy road, and there's a shoulder, and I was walking on it. But I mean, I was, certainly in fear of my life, and I just would be mortified if something ever happened to anybody that was following my lead, walking that, in terms of an accident or something like that. And so we really need to find ways to bridge some of the sections that are just too dangerous because of automotive things. And so that said, there are passages, there are ways, if there's people who are interested in finding or volunteering time to hike sections, like we know where the issues are, and we know possible alternative routes. And so the goal now is to send scouts to hike a day or 2 or 3 through certain sections to kind of figure out possible alternatives. And so that's on the table, and it's just one of those things that just it needs a concerted effort. It needs a plan and a way to mark the future scouting missions, and then a way to integrate that information so that we can then adapt and keep track. Luckily, Stephen, who I mentioned earlier, is around, and so there's 2 of us that have done it, and we collaborate periodically on ideas about steps to take. It's just busy people, busy lives, and it's not something that's on either of ours front burner.
Immediate radar. And it's not like all the land between Mendocino and Lake Tahoe needs to be perfectly protected for people to walk through. Just like with the Camino, I think it's really cool to just understand that it moves through civilization and the edges and wilderness and all of it in between. So
perfect.
But it's more about I mean, I know in the Camino they still had a little space for the pilgrims, or for the most part there was always it always made sense.
Right. So right now there's a perspective idea of rerouting it kind of 30 miles north of where the route I took.
How do you feel about that?
I feel great. And it would be really nice to see that happen, because it goes through a really cool wildlife refuge, and it comes out of it leaves the Yuba River and moves, and it would be across the again 30 miles north of Yuba City, and it would probably be in a much slower zone. You wouldn't go through Yuba City, but that's okay. I think that again, like what you said about, it's kind of neat to go through these more urban areas, but I don't think that that's completely necessary. And I think that what it would do is open up a much easier passage, but it would still be along roads, but they would be like super rural roads. They would be far more like through the rice and almond orchards, and so it's possible that someone could cross the valley and not see but 2 or 3 cars.
It'd be so cool to imagine something like that here, where in Spain on the Camino there's spaces to sleep at night. Of course there's something about finding a spot in the almond orchard too, or the wildlife refuge at 10 o'clock at night that you thought the road
with that over. I will say this, and that is that I had a really palpable experience. And again, I'd only been in California for 4 or 5 months, but it was nearly palpable, the feeling of the landowners versus the migrants. Like you think of the Okies, like the Great Dust Bowl, and the people who were beat up at the border. That's still here. Like, it's still palpable. To me, as a person with a backpack walking across the state, I definitely encountered energy that felt to me very similar to that outsiders don't belong kind of an energy. And maybe that's nationwide, but in this environment, I really was very clear that was still alive to some degree, and that squatting in these people's almond orchards was a major faux pas, because it was just ingrained generationally in their families. And I don't mean that in a general way to our listeners here. I mean, I think that the people in this valley, there's a big spectrum of people that as far as acceptance and so forth. But I really thought long and hard about the role of the hobo, if you will, and that hobo energy, and that kind of feeling of somebody who's not of this place and who doesn't appear to, quote unquote, have a job or something, a drifter, how unwelcome they are in this place. And that song, "This land is my land and this land is your land." And here I am walking across this beautiful state, and I'm confined basically to a 12-foot corridor, because on either side of that road, besides the
You're not welcome.
ditch, there was barbed wire fences with "do not trespass" signs. And so it was very limited. I was very confined in terms of like where I was allowed to be. And then, sneaking off into an orchard or something like that. I mean, I would find myself going several rows in, going deep into this almond orchard, just to lay a sleeping bag down, because I didn't want headlights to shine upon me. I felt vulnerable in terms of the owner of that land finding me and being very disapproving of the fact that I was there. I felt like an outsider.
I'd be pretty scared of doing that.
Yeah.
And being, I don't know, people being mad at me in the middle of the night or early in the morning.
Not a good feeling.
Something.
Definitely had one guy get very upset because he thought that I was about to encroach upon his private space.
Even though you're on the road or something?
Yeah, he had seen me, he had driven past me earlier in the day, an hour before, and seen me with my backpack and things, and had seen me stop near his property, and then got in his truck and approached me and made it very clear to me that I was not welcome on his property. And that was, it was aggressive and it was scary. I definitely told him I had no intention of this, and then I moved on. But even so, after the fact, when I went to find my little spot, which actually was on, I think, public land along the Sacramento River, I made extra caution to cover my own foot tracks, because I felt very uncomfortable by this person's aggressive energy. Mm-hmm. And it made me sad to think that once upon a time people would have been more welcome to people, to travelers, be it cowboys, like 3 people on horses traveling across the landscape that are just stopping to sleep next to a river. That would have maybe been acceptable to landowners or something, because...
I think about how the Central Valley used to be a one giant oak savanna that was not owned by anyone. And people traveled from the mountains to the ocean through the mass oaks and grasslands. And
I think where it brought me was what made it so aggressive for these landowners to feel so protective. And it, to me, it was the protection of jobs. And it's the same thing we're facing now with these issues around migration and so forth, of like new people, like we feel like new people threaten our security because they're going to somehow undermine our presence or holding or something like that. And it was interesting to encounter that, because I in no way threatened this person's job security, but yet it just was so ingrained into their thinking that it carried a type of weight in them of just like, this is what we do. We run people off. And that was sad for me because, again, this idea of this pilgrimage across the state could be a beautiful thing if people could just recognize, oh, no, please come camp on my land. Mm-hmm. Like it would be beautiful.
Like they do on the Camino.
Like they do on the Camino.
I mean, some places people are not as into the camping, but most people just kind of accept, okay, this is,
Well, on the Camino, there's not so much a need for camping because there's really cheap,
like $5
the hospitaleros, like these places that are designed to house the spiritual journeyers. Because the idea is that on the Camino, everybody's there for this spiritual purpose, and so these churches will come and set up cots or bunk beds to hold these people. And so there's but I think the local economy of these towns in Spain recognize the value of the pilgrims, that they buy bread and cheese and
wine,
yogurt, whatever. They actually, the reason those villages, in other words, if you're unfortunate enough to be a village 5 kilometers north of the Camino de Santiago, you're not doing so well. Your church doesn't have its, little tip jars filled. Your cafe doesn't have its steady flow of espresso buyers. That's a different thing. And so, obviously here we're not an economic factor in these people's reality as far as like the green path, isn't going to, at this moment, be an economic viability. But where's the heart? Where's the heart of the people that can recognize the journeyer, the pilgrim, and provide a safe haven for those people, or just a place to rest? It's not in the heart of the American people to actually do something like what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's so foreign to our reality, and that's something that I found so refreshing on the Camino. And in Europe in general, there's just more, you can hitchhike easier and walk and be on a bike and all those things a lot easier than you can in the States and a lot of places too. So
it's certainly accepted and encouraged. And that, I think, is something that we all need to look at within ourselves. I think that this concept, that the hero's journey is, what's his name? Joseph Campbell. Thank you. As Joseph Campbell refers to it as, is such a deep archetype. And a refreshing one. I mean, imagine if you can just lay down your life for 1 month to go do something different. If everybody did that,
it would change everything.
It would change everything. Because for me, pilgrimage has been a major factor in me learning to not take everything so seriously. I mean, I'm an intense person as an agriculturalist, as a farmer, as a gardener, as a person who grows plants. I'm so committed that it sometimes becomes overwhelming. Just I got to roll all the hoses up. I got to put all the shovels away. I got to, like, that feeling of needing to take care of everything becomes so intense. And then I feel like the most freedom I've ever experienced was 3 months of walking across Spain in one direction, not allowed to turn around. You have to be up every morning at 8 a.m. They turn the lights out at 9:30. You can't change if you leave this trail, you have left it was one of the most confining experiences I've ever been through. Like when they say curfew is at 9:30, we lock the door, and if you're not in here, you're sleeping outside. that was one of the most confining experiences I've ever had. And yet the pilgrimage this way, to walk that thing, was one of the most freeing experiences. And I think there's a paradox in it, which is that if you create enough structure for yourself, you can actually experience freedom. You know, like sometimes I think that like our sense of freedom by United States standards is actually the very thing that ruins our sense, because we have so many choices of what we can do with ourselves or our time that we end up feeling ungrounded.
Yes.
You know?
I find myself there sometimes, and I've been feeling drawn back to pilgrimage for that reason.
The last thing I'd like to say is that for me, when I walked from Nevada City, which is it's in the eastern side of Northern California, when I walked to the coast in 16 days, it suddenly made very aware to me the possibility of acorn for seaweed trade. You know, the fact that the indigenous people of this area could have been connected to the coast. When you hear people say, well, the indigenous people went to the coast and got seaweed and brought it back, you think, I don't know, like that sounds kind of, I mean, maybe, I guess, a little, you know, but once you do it, you say, I mean, that wasn't that hard. Like, yeah.
If you didn't have roads, it would be even easier.
You know?
I mean, maybe the path is straight because you have a road, but then you have the cars whipping by.
I'm sure there was paths and routes and things. Yeah. I mean, these people had hundreds of years to develop this kind of a thing. Meaning, it sounds crazy to walk to the coast from here.
But that's because we live in a car reality.
It's because we live in a car reality. But once you get to that human scale perspective, then yes, you walk 16 days. And sure, it's a long time. And they probably did it in a longer. I mean, I was moving pretty fast. But those people, I mean, with a group, if I was walking with 7, 8 other people and we were having a fun time doing it, I would sign up for it every year because it was a good time. And I think that we underestimate how connected long distance places really probably were, because we
haven't done it ourselves.
Haven't done it ourselves.
Own bodies. Is there a place where you're found on the internet that people could possibly find you if they wanted to look up your work?
I made a website for the my pilgrimage work. Unfortunately, I used Shutterfly as the place to post this. This is 10 years ago. And so it's an awkward web address, if you will. Shutterfly, it's just like, because it's
we can put it in the show notes too if you want to find it. And it's still clickable. Like it's still there.
It's clickable, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, sweet.
It's there. Like and there's stuff on both pilgrimages. My walk across Spain. The first one, folks, I did a second I came back to Spain to the point where I finished, and then I began again in 2017, and I walked all the way back 600 miles from where I finished back to the place where I started in order to conclude something that felt like a very important journey. I think it's interesting because it's only in the past 50 years or so, 70 years, that people have walked to a sacred place and then got on an airplane and flew home. In other words, that's standard operational status for people on the Camino de Santiago, is to walk to the church in Santiago de Compostela and then go to the airport and get on a plane and fly back to wherever in the world they came from. But in the old days, people got to that church or to Finisterre, and then they turned around and walked back to the place where they began, to their home.
So it was
to
only
their families.
They were only halfway done when they got there.
They're only halfway done. Like it's crazy to think about like a journey on the Camino de Santiago as being like such an amazing experience, right? And that was only half of the experience. And what's the other half? Because at that point you're meeting everybody who's on their way. And so,
and you're telling them the next town's great.
The next town's great. No, there was incredible communication that was happening. We were swapping information upon great places to stay or other little hostels or restaurants or people, or I tried to think about what it would have been like 100 years ago when there would have been people actually creating a network of information, and because today, very few people actually walk the road back east.
I met someone that was doing that. It was this older man with his dog, and he pretty much lived on the Camino, and he just would walk and walk back, walk and walk back.
And that's the only people that are doing that. I mean,
yeah.
I know what you mean. I've met those people too. There's a lot of people who are in a sort of quasi-vagrant state of existing on the Camino, and it's kind of a beautiful thing. And they're also a little sketchy at times, it seems, at least to me.
Would you do the Camino again?
Would I do the Camino again? Certainly. I'm a little bit weary now because now I feel like I've created a tradition within my own soul that I have to walk it both ways. And so if I was to walk one way, I would need to walk the other way. But, just for our listeners, I would like to add that there's many routes. The Camino that I walked, and I assume that you walked, was the Camino Frances, which is kind of the direct and traditional route from France to Santiago de Compostela. But there's also a Ruta Norte, the northern route that goes along the coast that is supposedly very beautiful, very, very much switchbacks through these like very small, beautiful seacoast towns, longer, harder, more desolate. And then there's the Camino Primitivo that goes over the Europas through the woods. It's a much more...
There's one that comes through Portugal too, right?
There's the Portuguese route that comes up. And then there's also the Camino Plata, the silver route that comes a little bit like a diagonal, like a 45-degree diagonal across Spain, from southern Spain, like Sevilla, to northwestern Spain. And that's the one I would like to do. But it's a long one, and it's through deserts and mountains. And I think it's very difficult. Just in that it's so barren and there's so few people that do it. And so there's not a lot of resources.
Something that struck me that I think I'll never forget by walking on foot across Spain rather than being a tourist in a tour bus was just meeting the townspeople and being in the towns that you would never get taken to on a tour bus if you were to go through.
Yeah.
And the way that the people lived, you walked by their vineyards or you walked by their little farms. The way they looked, they were small people, like these older, some villages seemed to be only older people, And I remember walking through one village and everyone had their garlic out drying. And you just walked from one end to the other and everyone was curing their garlic, and then you left the town. You're like, and there was tumbleweeds blowing by, and you're like, am I in Spain? Is this is Spain? I never would have thought, I could have been in South America or something, I don't know, or some other planet. It just didn't seem like what I envisioned what Spain would be, and yet it was all amazing because this is what it is. And, yeah, I really liked that, so.
It's a very close-up view. And that's like, we began with, I think, the statement that I said about having a human scale for things, and like I said, I have a half a mile wide by 300 mile long. And from the Camino, it's a 5 kilometer wide by 1,000 kilometer long picture map, like and very deeply ingrained in my mind. I mean, I'm sure I can mention to you the village of San Juan Ortega, and you can probably have very visceral memories of what the forest right around that town looked like. I have like the back of my hand, I know the Camino de Santiago because I walked it so clearly. And every night I would lay down and I would go to sleep and I would rewind my entire day plus all the days before it. I would until I fell asleep. And so I would just walk every night I would walk the Camino backwards. And there's something to say about that, the depth of feeling, and knowing a landscape. And I think in some ways that's what we yearn for, is to know a watershed like the back of our hands. And for many of us, we live in places where that's not possible. And yet, that is a familial desire in our bones. And so I just encourage all of us to find our pilgrimage, whatever it is.
I just thought of the Mountains to Sea Trail in North Carolina too, which is the east-west or west-east.
Mm-hmm.
Walking across North Carolina. Have you done that one?
No, but Frank Cook.
He did that one?
He did that one as well. And so that's another piece of that kind of heritage that we can all invest in, invest in other people's heritage and add to it such that it's like cultural topsoil.
I've always wanted to canoe there's a river that runs through the county where I grew up, and it goes all the way to the Pamlico Sound in North Carolina. And it was definitely a part of a trade route system, the native peoples that lived in the area where I'm from. There was like a big encampment there, and it was the place between the mountains and the ocean, and that all along there was trade, and people don't really boat on those rivers, but it's totally canoeable. And if
you don't do that before you die, I will have words in the afterlife.
I have some friends that I've talked to about doing it with me.
Please do it. Please do it.
Well, I think we should leave it at that. We're here and it's getting pretty late, and I think we both had big long days today, and this was really wonderful to talk about pilgrimages. It's brought back a lot of memories for me of my walk in Spain and hearing about your experiences. So thanks so much for sitting down and telling me about your Green Path Trail walk in California.
Thanks, Kelly, for doing all this.
Yeah.
Great to have the airwaves enlivened.
This episode of the Ground Shots podcast was produced by Opia Creative. Our music is by Mother Marrow. If you'd like to help us continue to make this audio project a reality, consider becoming a monthly supporter on our Patreon page at patreon.com/ofsedgeandsalt, where we have rewards like entry into patron-only giveaways, additional audio interviews, extra educational content, and much more. You can also share our work and give us a review on iTunes. Visit our website at ofsedgeandsalt.com to see what else we're up to and a log of our episodes when they come out. Check out our show notes for information about how to find us and our guests. Until next time, y'all, thanks for listening.